What happens when prosecutors investigate their own successful murder case and decide they might have gotten it wrong? When DNA evidence excludes the convicted killer, but a paperwork error keeps him technically guilty? Welcome to part 2 of the Adnan Syed saga, where the justice system basically threw up its hands and said, "We honestly don't know anymore." By 2022, the legal system seemed done with Adnan Syed. The Maryland Supreme Court had upheld its conviction despite Serial's revelations. The U.S. Supreme Court wouldn't hear his case, and public attention had mostly moved on to other true crime obsessions. Syed was serving his 23rd year in prison, and it looked like he was going to die there. Then something extraordinary happened. The Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, the same prosecutor's office that had convicted Syed in 2000, decided to take another look at their own case. This wasn't prompted by new appeals from his defense team. This was prosecutors voluntarily questioning whether they'd gotten it right. And this, by the way, is about as common as unicorns in American criminal justice. Prosecutors' offices don't typically investigate their own successful convictions. Once you've gotten a guilty verdict and exhausted the appeals process, the case is considered settled. Prosecutors move on to new cases, not old ones. But Baltimore had established a conviction review unit, one of the growing numbers of such units around the country designed to examine potential wrongful convictions. And Adnan's case, thanks to Serial's spotlight, was an obvious candidate for review. What they found would turn everything upside down. The investigation that began in 2022 uncovered information that would have been explosive back in 1999. Prosecutors found evidence of 2 alternate suspects who had been known to investigators during the original case, but were never properly investigated. One of these suspects had reportedly made a threat against Hae Min Lee, stating that he would make her disappear, the kind of statement that, in any reasonable investigation, would warrant serious follow-up, yet there's no evidence that investigators pursued this lead with the thoroughness it deserved. This revelation highlighted a fundamental problem with the original investigation: tunnel vision. Once police received that anonymous tip pointing them toward Adnan, they appeared to have focused their efforts on building a case against him rather than conducting a thorough investigation of all possible suspects. The existence of viable alternate suspects doesn't prove Adnan's innocence, but it raises serious questions about whether the investigation was comprehensive enough to justify the certainty of a murder conviction. Maybe even more significant than the alternate suspects was new DNA testing conducted on evidence from the crime scene that had never been tested before. The results excluded Adnan Syed as a contributor. This is the kind of evidence that carries weight in ways that testimonial evidence simply cannot. DNA doesn't have motivation. It doesn't change its story, and it doesn't make deals with prosecutors. When properly collected and tested, it provides objective scientific evidence about who was and wasn't present at a crime scene. The DNA results didn't positively identify another suspect, but they scientifically excluded Adnan from biological evidence connected to Hae's murder. Combined with the alternative suspects and the long-standing questions about Jay Wilde's testimony and cell phone evidence, prosecutors concluded that they no longer had confidence in Adnan's conviction. The prosecutor's 2022 review also took another hard look at the cell phone tower data that had been central to the original conviction. What they found confirmed what defense experts had been arguing for years. The technology wasn't reliable enough to support the conclusions drawn at trial. The AT&T disclaimer that was never shown to the jury stated clearly that incoming calls couldn't be relied upon for location information. In 1999, cell phone location technology was new enough that courts and juries might be forgiven for not understanding its limitations. By 2022, those limitations were well established. The prosecutor's office acknowledged that the cell phone evidence, as presented in trial, was not reliable enough to support a conviction. On September 19, 2022, prosecutors filed a motion to vacate Adnan's conviction. The motion cited the unreliable cell phone evidence, the failure to disclose information about alternative suspects, and the new DNA results that excluded him. Judge Melissa Finn granted the motion, and Syed walked out of the Baltimore courthouse a free man after 23 years, 1 month, and 6 days in prison. The scene outside the courthouse was emotional, with family members embracing and crying as Syed tasted freedom for the first time since he was 17 years old. A month later, in October 2022, prosecutors formally dropped all charges against Adnan. It looked like vindication, like the system had finally corrected a terrible mistake. Syed appeared headed toward the kind of complete exoneration that would allow him to rebuild his life and maybe seek compensation for his decades-long wrongful imprisonment. But this story was far from over. In a twist that would make legal thriller writers jealous, the Maryland Court of Special Appeals reinstated Adnan's murder conviction in March 2023, not because new evidence had emerged proving his guilt, not because the DNA testing was flawed, not because the alternative suspects had been ruled out. The conviction was reinstated because of a procedural error. Hae Min Lee's brother, Young Lee, had not been given adequate notice about the September 2022 hearing where Syed's conviction was vacated. Under Maryland's victim notification laws, victims' families have the right to be present and heard at such proceedings. The failure to provide proper notice violated these rights. But let that sink in for a moment. A murder conviction was reinstated not based on evidence of guilt or innocence, but because of a paperwork problem. The decision highlighted the sometimes Byzantine nature of our legal system, where procedural requirements can override findings. The appeals court wasn't saying Syed was guilty, they were saying the process of declaring him not guilty was flawed. The Maryland Supreme Court upheld this ruling in August 2024, ordering a new hearing while allowing Syed to remain free. The legal system had created a situation where a man could be simultaneously free and convicted of murder. The final resolution came on March 14, 2025, when Judge Jennifer Schiffer found a creative way to thread this legal needle. Rather than retry the procedural aspects of vacating the conviction, she used Maryland's Juvenile Restoration Act to resentence Adnan. This allows judges to reduce sentences for crimes committed by juveniles, recognizing that young offenders can be rehabilitated and deserve second chances. Syed had been 17 when Hae was murdered, making him eligible under the statute. Judge Schiffer reduced Syed's sentence to time served and ordered 5 years of supervised probation. This allowed him to remain free while technically maintaining his conviction. It was a Solomon-like solution that satisfied no one but completely resolved an impossible legal situation. So here's where we end up in 2025. Adnan Syed is a free man with a murder conviction on his record. He's working at Georgetown University's Prisons and Justice Initiative while taking classes. He's building a new life while serving supervised probation for a murder that prosecutors no longer believe he committed. This outcome satisfies absolutely no one. Syed's supporters wanted full exoneration and acknowledgement that he was wrongfully convicted. Hae Min Lee's family wanted definitive answers about who killed their daughter and sister. The prosecutor's office wanted to correct what they believed was a miscarriage of justice. Instead, we got a legal compromise that keeps everyone equally unhappy while highlighting the fundamental limitations of our justice system. 26 years after Hae Min Lee's murder, we still don't have definitive answers about who killed her. The alternative suspects identified by prosecutors haven't been charged. The case remains officially unsolved despite having a convicted killer. This isn't the clean resolution we expect when we learn about true crime cases. There's no moment where the real killer is revealed, no dramatic confession that ties everything together, no sense that justice has finally been served. What we have instead is messy, a complicated story about the limitations of human knowledge and the imperfection of legal systems. We have competing narratives that all contain elements of truth, but none that provide complete answers. Looking back at Serial's impact, it's clear that the podcast accomplished something unprecedented in American criminal justice. It took a closed case and forced the system to re-examine its conclusions. It created public pressure that contributed to the eventual investigation that led to Adnan's release. But Serial didn't solve the case. It didn't prove Adnan's innocence or identify the real killer. What it did was demonstrate that our justice system, for all its procedural safeguards and evidentiary standards, can get things wrong. And when it does, correcting those mistakes are extraordinarily difficult. Maybe the most profound lesson of the Adnan Syed case is the importance of intellectual humility in matters of criminal justice. The original prosecutors were certain enough of Syed's guilt to seek life imprisonment. The serial podcast raised enough doubt to convince millions of listeners that he might be innocent. The 2022 prosecutors became convinced enough of his innocence to drop all charges. Yet, none of these certainties produced the complete truth. What we're left with is the uncomfortable but honest conclusion that sometimes we don't and can't know everything. Sometimes the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Sometimes the investigators have gaps, and sometimes our legal system produces outcomes that feel unsatisfying. In 2025, Adnan represents something unique in American criminal justice, a man whose freedom was secured not by proving his innocence, but by demonstrating that his guilt couldn't be established with the certainty that justice requires. The real tragedy isn't that we don't know whether Syed killed Hae Min Lee. The real tragedy is that Hae Min Lee is dead. Her killer may never be definitively identified, and our imperfect system of justice has done the best it can with incomplete information. Sometimes the most honest answer is admitting we don't have all the answers. In a world that increasingly demands certainty, the Adnan Syed case forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that absolute truth isn't always achievable. Even with decades of investigation, millions of dollars in legal proceedings, and the intention of the entire nation. That might be the most important lesson of all. Thanks for listening to 10-Minute Murder, bingeable true crime stories. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and I really appreciate you listening to part 1 and part 2 about this case. And I'm curious, is this the case, is this the podcast that got you into listening to true crime podcasts? It was for me. I knew that podcasts existed back in 2014 when this happened, but I didn't immediately listen to this. I was of the mindset of, well, I can watch documentaries on TV. Why am I going to listen to this one? What's all this hype about? So strangely, as much as I am into true crime, I didn't immediately buy into the Serial podcast. And then one day, I think I was cleaning up around the house or maybe mowing the lawn or something like that, and I wanted something to listen to. So I figured out how to download podcasts. And back then, it wasn't like a simple thing like it is now. You have to find it and download it. And so I thought, I'll give it a chance. I was hooked immediately. I already loved audiobooks at that time, and this was kind of like an audiobook, but real life. It's a real life case. It's like listening to a documentary, and I ate it up. I loved it. Now it would be 6 years after that before I started doing my own podcast. It would take a pandemic and me being bored out of my mind to create this podcast. But here we are, talking about the podcast that got me into podcasts on the podcast that I later created. All right, that's going to do it. That is your episode for today. Thank you again so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder. I'll see you next time.